Hey everyone, welcome back. This week we finally got to see the Republican Party's proposal to raise the debt ceiling. Admittedly, it's about 4 months late, but hey, better late than never, I suppose. Now, when I went through the bill, there were two main takeaways that I had. Number one, they're trying to balance the budget by cutting social programs and other important government services that are utilized by everyday Americans, and especially those Americans who find themselves in dire situations, whether that be food insecurity, unexpected poverty, unemployment, etc. The second thing they're trying to do with this piece of legislation is essentially overturn and erase the vast majority of the accomplishments of President Biden in his first 2 years in office. So, today I wanted to go through the proposal, kind of break down the major components and what impacts they might have, as well as discuss how this whole process might impact future negotiations regarding raising the debt ceiling. Let's start off with the headline proposal of this bill, which is, of course, budget cuts. Republicans are proposing to bring federal spending back to 2022 levels, which would cut about $130 billion off of the deficit. That's a pretty significant savings, to be sure, but what we don't know right now is where those cuts are going to be made. Kevin McCarthy conveniently left that out of this bill and kicked that can down the road to December when a new budget would have to be passed, saying, well, we'll decide what to cut then, but we're not going to tell you about it now. Now, he's promised not to cut things like Medicare, Medicaid, defense spending, or veterans benefits, which, there's no guarantee that that will be true when December rolls around, but even if he does leave those things alone, cuts are going to have to be made somewhere. Are they going to cut other forms of healthcare assistance like Medicaid? Are they going to cut food programs that help feed hungry children? Are they going to cut border security? Are they going to cut farm subsidies? Who knows? Something's going to have to get cut, but Republicans right now are saying, don't worry about that. When, yeah, that's probably something we should be worrying about if they're going to cut that much money out of the federal budget. Speaking of cutting programs that everyday Americans might use in their time of need, Republicans are also trying to implement enhanced work requirements for programs like Medicaid and food security. And on the surface, the Republican talking point makes a lot of sense. We don't want people just leeching off the system, so by having these work requirements, people will go out and be productive members of the community by taking at least a part-time job, or volunteering in their community, or even just looking for a job. However, the data doesn't bear that talking point out. Whenever Republican states have implemented similar policies to raise their state work requirements above the federal minimum, they haven't really seen that big of a change in unemployment or economic productivity. What they have seen is a large number of people drop out of these programs as they're no longer eligible. And some estimates based on a prior version of this bill that was being discussed indicate that you could lose 1 in 4 families off of food stamps. Again, these are people who are in poverty and are just trying to feed their families. So having 1 in 4 Americans lose access to this program because of these enhanced requirements doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Especially because a lot of these programs benefit the districts that Republicans claim to represent. The last component of Republicans' plan to rein in the budget is a 1% cap on annual increases in federal spending. Again, on the surface, this checks out. If you want to rein in spending, putting a cap on increases the spending makes sense. However, this cap immediately hamstrings the government's ability to respond to a crisis should it arise. Something like a 2008 financial crisis, a Hurricane Katrina, a COVID-19 pandemic, or, who else knows what might happen. But in these times of crisis, the U.S. government responds by spending money to help out those who are impacted by whatever the crisis is. And if you have this 1% cap in place, that money's got to come from somewhere. So you're going to have to pull money out of the defense budget or border security or any other federal program in order to cover this crisis. Or, when the crisis arises, they're just going to get rid of this 1% cap. So putting it in place in the first place is really dumb. Because instead of trying to responsibly budget, which is, again, what the whole budget process is for, they're just setting this arbitrary cap and saying, yeah, we don't care if there's a crisis we might have to respond to. We'll deal with that if we have to, when we have to. And inevitably, it will be when, not if. So, this is just a really dumb policy idea that Republicans are just using as a talking point to try and rein in spending. Even though they do tend to spend just as much as Democrats when they're in power. In addition to cutting the federal budget, there are a number of proposals in this bill that would essentially get rid of the vast majority of President Biden's accomplishments over the last 2 years, especially when it comes to things like student loan forgiveness, green energy initiatives, increasing the efficiency of the IRS so you get your tax return faster, etc. The two big ones that stuck out to me were the removal of several tax credits for both corporations and people who are trying to turn to more energy-efficient solutions, such as building or purchasing electric vehicles. And that struck me because Republicans generally aren't about tax increases, but here they are proposing to increase your taxes. The other big one that stuck out to me was their attempt to repeal funding from the IRS. Now, I know the Republican talking point that this is hiring a bunch of armed IRS agents that are going to come and storm local small businesses as a part of audits, and that's not at all what the bill did. It hired customer service reps and other analysts to help speed the process along so that you get your tax return faster. So again, Republicans are saying that, no, we want you to have a worse tax experience. We don't want you to have your questions answered, and we want you to get your return more slowly. Now again, essentially increasing your taxes. Again, not a very Republican thing to do, but let's face it, that's what their proposals would end up doing for the average American. Now that we've discussed what this bill might do if it was passed into law, let's think about whether it can pass in the first place, as this bill is just another part of the ongoing negotiations over raising the debt ceiling. Now, the first thing it would have to do is obviously pass the House, and right now it's not clear that the votes are there. There are both moderate and very extreme members of the Republican Party who are unsure about this. Moderates think it goes too far and would knock too many people in their districts off of key social services, which obviously would be bad for their re-election. But there are also very conservative Republicans who are saying these cuts don't go far enough. Again, this is your Marjorie Taylor Greene attempts to defund the police in the form of the FBI and other DOJ offices. And yeah, so nobody's truly happy with this yet, and it doesn't appear right now that the votes are there to pass this through the House. They might be, but Kevin McCarthy only has a margin of error of 4 votes. 5 votes, actually. 5 would be the number that tips over. So we'll have to see if he can even pass this through the House. They've said they want to bring it up for a vote next week. And if it passes, could be interesting because then it would go over to the Senate, where this really doesn't have any chance of going anywhere as Democrats control that, but it does at least set the stage for negotiations. So, what might these negotiations look like? And I think there are 2 possible ways it could go. Number 1, we actually see what we expect from negotiations. The Democrats have their starting position with a clean debt ceiling, we now have this Republican proposal, and they meet somewhere in the middle. That middle probably has the vast majority of the attacks on Biden's accomplishments knocked out, purely because Biden's not going to want to give those up going into re-election. But you could actually see some slightly less deep cuts into the federal budget, and weirdly that 1% cap implemented. And the reason that I think the 1% cap is a win that Biden can give Republicans is that it's fairly easy to get rid of in the future. It's just a law after all, so Biden, if the Democrats got power in 2024, could just repeal it, and it would be gone. Or, if there was a crisis, there would be political pressure on both parties to get rid of that in order to allow the government to spend the necessary funds to help the nation recover. So, while yes, it's a bad policy, it's a bad policy that's fairly simple to reverse relative to other things. So, this might be a win that Biden gives Republicans in order to reach a deal. However, when it comes to any negotiation, you always want to compare the agreement on the table with your best alternative, and the House is currently producing an alternative to Kevin McCarthy's plan. The Problem Solver Caucus, which is made up of a combination of Republicans and Democrats, is currently drafting their own version of a debt ceiling increase. Now, the details on that one are a little more vague at this point in time, but they're calling for some fairly moderate budget cuts. They're not calling for any cap or any repeal of major Biden initiatives. And essentially at the end, they want to establish some sort of committee or commission to study the problem and propose solutions by the time that Congress starts laying out the budget come December, which is a pretty standard way for Congress to kick that can down the road. But that bill is going to have some bipartisan support just by the nature of who drafted it. That Problem Solvers Bipartisan Caucus has Republicans in it. And since Democrats only need 5 Republicans to force a bill over Kevin McCarthy's head, the Problem Solver Caucus bill could easily be what actually ends up passing out of the House in the long term. And since that will be a mostly clean debt ceiling, the Senate would likely pass that in a somewhat bipartisan manner, put it on Biden's desk, he would sign it, and we would revisit the issue when it's time to actually debate the budget, which is what this whole debate is about in the first place. The key indicator to watch to tell us which path we might end up taking is going to be if Kevin McCarthy can pass his proposal through the House or not. If he can get it passed, we're much more likely to go down the route where we meet in the middle of this bill and the Democrats' starting position, and we get that sort of compromise debt ceiling raise, which won't be very clean, but it'll be cleaner than what Republicans are currently wanting. On the other hand, if McCarthy can't get his bill passed through the House, then we're probably going to go through the Problem Solvers Caucus route, and that will favor the Democratic Party position quite a bit more, simply because it's a bit more of a bipartisan process, and they're basically going to kick that can down the road towards the budget fight in December. However, of the two, I would certainly prefer that it goes the Problem Solvers Caucus route because, as I explained in the course of this video, this Republican proposal is purely designed to inflict damage on those Americans who can least afford to suffer the effects of this bill, as well as to undo the progress that we have made over the last 2 years. And that just isn't good policy, nor is it good politics going into 2024. Think about it.